So this is our last night, actually morning for you, on this incredible tale, Cinderella. I hope you appreciate the kind of deep dive that we've been doing into it. So last time, because of Bob Dylan's song about Cinderella, he used the image, I think, of a level one anima, the woman as a sex object. He used the image of Betty Davis to illustrate Cinderella in that manner. In fact, that manner in which Cinderella could have got trapped in that mode as a sex object. But for me, a better illustration of the pair and the woman as a sex object was Betty Gable from World War II. And this is a picture that a lot of the American soldiers had in their duffel bags or as pinups beside their bed. So let's continue with our fairy tale. So the next morning, he, the prince, went to his father and said to him, "No one shall be my wife, but she whose foot the golden slipper fits." Then were the two sisters glad, for they had pretty feet. The eldest went with the shoe into her room and wanted to try it on, and her mother stood by, but she could not get her big toe into it, and the shoe was too small for her. Then the mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut the toe off. When you are queen, you shall have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. Then he took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. They were obliged, however, to pass the grave, and there, on the hazel tree, sat the two pigeons and cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep. There's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." So the shoe is associated with the feet, and hence one's standpoint in life. In myths, grabbing the heel of another person is a way of claiming the power over them or extracting a boon. The great power of the feet may explain why the many spots where the footprints of the devils, the heroes, and so on have been left in stone. So it is the mother who orders her own daughter's toe to be cut off. Within an individual psyche, this is an internalized superego brutality towards the feminine by the feminine. The mother is willing to sacrifice the connection with the earth that a foot implies, hexagram 2, the archetypal feminine, for the riches and power she associates with being queen. This is the gestalt of the rich man married to the sick wife with riches and power as a substitute for the genuine feminine. So the toe is associated with direction, a person's way of life, and the De Vries Symbol Dictionary mentions the great toes of the Levites in the Bible were anointed, and the big toe is associated with intuition and the head. Putting these associations together, it's about a person having a sense of autonomy in relationship to the collective powers, what Jung was so focused on. Stepmom's brutality sacrifices all of this for the thought of her daughter becoming queen. So as Osper pointed out, there are situations in life where we squeeze ourselves into situations, partnerships, bargains, and so on. But we die within if too much energy goes into prestige, persona, facade, and image. We saw this motif in the Academy Award-winning film Titanic, in the scene where the mother is painfully tightening her daughter's corset, as daughter is doubting her engagement to a wealthy man while falling in love with a loving, poor stowaway in steerage. This scene illustrates the archetypal motifs that are alive in modern culture. So the prince's uncertainty is the masculine anima side as consciousness of Cinderella's doubts about her real identity, a true or a false bride. As Osper puts it, quote, "It takes a while for you to become an ally to your psyche. So we have to grow in the side where we do not know what is the real me," end of quote. So again, we have the two pigeons coming from the emerging feminine archetype, anchored in the archetypal feminine earth as hexagram 2. They are enlightening the masculine, the prince, raising consciousness. It is only after Cinderella has strengthened her connection with her positive, nurturing feminine that the prince is attracted to her and is now being educated by the same source that guided Cinderella. So we say in English, a little bird told me, related to divination by the flight of birds like Apollo was able to do, psychologically related to the intuitive function. The masculine is becoming aware of the pain in the feminine realm, but is still unaware of its role in causing the pain. So we are introduced to the true bride, false bride motif in many fairy tales. The false bride is within the gestalt of the negative mother and the witch in this tale. It is not aware of the pain associated with the persona adopting the collective values of the culture. So next we read, "Then he looked at her foot and saw how the blood was trickling from it. He turned his horse round and took the false bride home again and said she was not the true one, and the other sister was to put the shoe on. Then this one went into the chamber and got her toes safely into the shoe, but her heel was too large. So her mother gave her a knife and said, 'Cut a bit off the heel. When you are queen, you shall have no more need to go on foot.' The maiden cut a bit off her heel, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her, but when they passed by the hazel tree, the two little pigeons sat on it and cried, 'Turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her, the true bride waits for you.'" So the prince has to be reminded by the two pigeons there is blood in the shoe and the true bride waits for you. The heel is related to the abdomen and the uterus. At its deepest, most archetypal level, this is about damage to Lao Tzu's Tao as the great mother and the source of all the 10,000 things. And in Jungian terms, the fecund realm of the unconscious. As a fractal of an archetype, this is the damage our species is doing to Mother Earth. Now, as in working with this fairy tale or with a dream image, something like that, we just have to imagine the brutality that if you took a knife to that heel there and cut part of it off just so you could fit into the shoe. And that's what I call feeling your way into the dream images. As the story continues, he looked down at her foot and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe and how it had stained her white stocking quite red. Then he turned his horse and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" "No," said the man. "There is a little stunted kitchen wench from my late wife left behind by her, but she cannot possibly be the bride." The king's son said he was to send her up to him. But the mother answered, "Oh no, she's too dirty. She cannot show herself." But he absolutely insisted on it. And Cinderella had to be called. First washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. Then she seated herself on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper, which fitted like a glove. And when she rose up and the king's son looked at her face, he recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him and cried, "This is the true bride." The stepmother and the two sisters were horrified and became pale with anger, with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed by the hazel tree, the two white doves cried, "Turn and peep, turn and peep. No blood is in the shoe. The shoe is not too small for her. The true bride rides with you. And when they had cried that, the two came down and placed themselves on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and remained sitting there. So the gestalt is of the father and stepmother maintaining their degrading attitude towards Cinderella, but the greater power of the prince as the emerging new dominant masculine in the higher realm of the archetype as potential king, if you will, in relation to a healthy natural feminine shows strong intentionality and direction. Now Cinderella first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. So Cinderella washing herself shows that she is ready to present herself, outgrow her darkness and negativity of being in the ashes, and reveal the full beauty of her inner self, the inner light symbolically signaled by that candle on the mantle after the return from the first ball. This was a conscious choice that began in the unconscious realm with the birds choosing between the good and the bad seeds. The prince had to see and recognize her in her humble and modest state, which would be like hexagram 15 modesty, to be aware of the difficult psychological background she had emerged from. In many fairy tales, the heroine must be recognized by her tutor in her mundane, degraded state. Cinderella seems to be innately aware that she is recognized only in her beauteous state. She could never escape servitude. I think this was the danger she barely escaped by fleeing the pigeon house and the pear tree before they were trapped up by the father. So Cinderella discarded her heavy wooden shoe, a symbol of the leaden step of depression and a poverty of feelings. This would be the alchemical of transmuting lead into gold. Cinderella was able to show her true self because she has the protection of the alchemical and therapeutic container of the archetypal masculine, the symbol of the prince as the son of the king, as representative on earth of God the divine. So just contrast this image to that of the dainty golden shoe that Cinderella was able to put on. So Anne Ulanoff in Cinderella and Her Sisters commented with regard to the perfect foot of Cinderella to her shoe and the sexual symbolism of the shoe as the vulva in relationship to the masculine phallus inserted into it, that a woman must establish a personal relationship to her sexual organ and her sexuality. So if you take this image of the shoe as a woman's unique fit to her body and her sexuality, then the masculine as the animus would be her unique image of her unconscious side and her deep connection to the unconscious. So we must always think of the connection between the spiritual and the body and the physical, and not to separate them. So in alchemy, the image for the wholeness is the coming together of the spirit and the body. And you can get trapped at either end. You can get trapped in the purely physical and the hedonic, or in the spiritual. Actually can be a way of escaping being in the body. And of course, you can look at this image either way. You can look at the foot as being the masculine and the shoe as kind of symbolic of the man's anima, his true self. So the prince gets confirmation from the self in the form of the message from the two white doves that this is the true bride, his soulmate, a feminine that has emerged out from under the oppressive domain of excessive old yang energy, the opening sentence of a rich father married to a sick wife as part of the old king's kingdom. The two birds are no longer autonomous elements in the archetypal domain, but being on Cinderella's shoulders are now closer to human consciousness and give her the ability to more consciously discriminate between what is good and bad for her well-being. The gods and goddesses always had their animal consorts. So in the last paragraph of the story we read, when the wedding with the king's son was to be celebrated, the two false sisters came and wanted to get into favor with Cinderella and share her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to the church, the elder was on the right side and the younger on the left, and the pigeons pecked out one eye from each of them. Afterwards, as they came back, the elder was on the left and the youngest at the right. And then the two pigeons pecked out the other eyes from each. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness all their days. So in folklore, there are amulets that provide protection against the evil eye, usually associated with malice, envy, and so on. The aggressive pecking and directed activity of the birds, first seen in sorting out the good from the bad seeds, now come to Cinderella's defense by blinding the eyes of the envious, rageful, and unrepentant stepsisters. Cinderella had been a pretty defenseless character. Psychologically, this is like aggressively putting an end to an inner tortured way of seeing oneself in a denigrating way and diminishing one's place in the world. The baleful gaze can come from one's family, the expectations of a society, and old beliefs about oneself. In real life, it takes a while to depotentiate a negative complex you have lived with for so long. So in the fairy tale illustrates the extraction of gold from the dung by the positive narcissism of displaying one's inner true self, integrating the display aspects that were in negative form in the stepsisters. So in the fairy tale, we saw three sets of threeness. 3 wishes for the father to bring something back from the fair, then 2 wishes to go to the ball, 3 appearances at the ball, and 3 shoe fittings. So Osper comments that Cinderella is a story about, quote, outgrowing a tremendous negativity toward oneself and growing towards a more positive outlook on life, end of quote. It takes tremendous emotional work to deal with the hardships involved on this journey. It takes gold and silver, yang and yin, for the process. As Asper puts it, if there is no feminine energy, people do not have an inner secure base and cannot display their masculine potentials. The masculine energy is active, a disruptor, and helps discern what is good and not good for oneself. So another way to appreciate the significant psychological dimensions of Grimm's Cinderella is to look briefly at one other version, and that is Charles Perrault's Cinderella or the Little Glass Slipper, which was published in France in 1695. And Walt Disney made several modifications of Perrault in his famous 1950 animated film on Cinderella, which is the dominant Western take on the fairy tale. So the most germane psychological differences relative to Grimm begin with Perrault's version being more like a morality play, with Cinderella being almost saint-like in her behavior, as was her mother. So Cinderella was of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. After Cinderella's true identity was revealed when her glass slipper fit her and she was to be married, the stepsisters, quote, threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Then Cinderella took them up and, as she embraced them, said that she forgave them with all her heart and wanted them always to love her, end of quote. And after the marriage, quote, Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her 2 sisters lodging in the palace, and that very same day matched them with 2 great lords of the court. Quite a different ending from Cinderella's pigeons pecking out the sisters' eyes as they went to and from the marriage altar. And there was no chopping off of a toe or part of a heel for the sisters to fit in the shoe, but rather they, quote, did all they possibly could to force their shoe, the foot into the slipper, but they did not succeed.
那在这个佩罗的这个版本里面当灰姑娘穿上那个鞋非常合脚的时候，那么她的灰姑娘的真实的身份就被暴露了。
So you can see how unrealistic this feels in comparison to what happens in real life. And that's why this version of the fairy tale is more like that of a saint, and why Ulyanov said that Cinderella was like a feminine Christ. So the influence of the father is almost the opposite of that presented in Grimm's, shown in the opening sentence, where the father was not described as a rich man married to a sick wife, but simply stated as, once there was a gentleman who married a second wife. When Cinderella was suffering under her stepsister's abuses, she, quote, bore it all patiently and dared not tell her father, who would have scolded her, for his wife governed him entirely. So you can see there's kind of a reverse of the masculine feminine energy as presented in Grimm's. And when you're working with a fairy tale as with a dream, you have to stick with the contents of the particular tale and the dream. So in the Perrault version, there was no father going to a fair, no branch knocking off his hat, or Cinderella crying at her mother's grave, nor a father chopping up a pigeon house or chopping down a pear tree when he suspected his daughter might be there. So the issue of envy is presented much more strongly and plainly in Perrault. The second wife was, quote, the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen, and her daughters were exactly like her in all things. And then, quote, the stepmother could not bear the good qualities of this pretty girl, and the less because they made her own daughters appear the more odious, end of quote. However, the stepsisters were not ugly in appearance. Quote, Cinderella, notwithstanding her coarse apparel, was 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, although they were always dressed very richly and, quote, they cut a very grand figure among those of quality when they went to the balls. So Anne Ulyanov, in her book Cinderella and Her Sisters, The Envy and the Envying, did a marvelous job exploring the important psychological issue of envy that incorporated several psychoanalytic traditions into a Jungian perspective. So Ulyanov is a Jungian analyst who taught at the prestigious Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And as I said before, she saw Cinderella as a feminine Christ. And you can see, if you're working with the Perrault version of this fairy tale, why Anne Ulyanov, teaching in a Christian seminary, would tend to see her as a feminine Christ. Pride is considered to be the worst of the 7 deadly sins, with evil being second. So Ulyanov describes pride as thinking, I'm good, I don't need to give it, I don't need you to give it to me, I am altogether self-sufficient. We must recognize our dependence, and as Winnicott put it, gratitude is dependence that is acknowledged. And by the way, the other 7 deadly sins are greed, wrath, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Ulyanov, in her book, explores all of those sins and compares them to the sin of envy and tells about how they're different, but I don't have time to go into all of those distinctions. Envy is about not recognizing the good aspects of ourselves. We project the good onto others and then resent them for having something good that we don't think we have. Using Grimm's Cinderella as an example, access to that good aspect, in this case, a healthy whole feminine in a woman, or the anima in a man, was destroyed by an overpowering masculine or yang energy. In Cinderella, we can imagine the woman as Cinderella's stepsisters selling themselves out to the masculine realm by trying to meet the standard of beauty they think the man wants, the weight and body type he likes, mothering the male, or letting themselves be treated like a sex object. In modern culture, a woman may come across as a bimbo or less educated so as not to make the man feel inferior to her. At one level, they resent themselves for reducing and punishing themselves in this way. They find someone in their environment to punish who they perceive to have the good, as the stepsisters did to Cinderella. Another way to think about it at the collective level, if the feminine is not honored in a society, then all the women in that society will feel inferior in some way, and one thing they will do will be to project their sense of inferiority onto another woman, and project their sense of unhappiness with themselves onto somebody, on some woman, other woman, and then proceed to punish and to belittle them so they can feel superior to them. And that idea would be more clearly presented in the Grimm version than the Cinderella Perrault version, because of the almost absence of the father in the Perrault version. So the stepsisters could have been envious of Cinderella, who may have been perceived to be more beautiful than them, or maybe more kind-hearted because she felt more love from her mother. As stepchildren, there can be a suspicion or outright experience that the biological father is biased toward his kin, but Cinderella's father seemed to have rejected her, as witnessed by the way he talked about her in disparaging terms and the deadly axe in the pigeon house and the pear tree incidents. There is a power and beauty in people who remain true to themselves despite the odds, but this arouses even greater envy in the envier. I'm reminded of how much hatred Martin Luther King Jr. generated in America for championing the rights and dignity of African Americans during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So the alchemical process of extracting the gold in the dung is to own our own projections. That what good we are seeing in others is something we have in ourselves, perhaps in an undeveloped or nascent form. We must ask ourselves if what we are envious of and persecuting in others is what we might be doing to the good in ourselves because we cannot honor it and cultivate it, or we are lazy or not courageous enough to do the difficult work of developing our potentials and or defend our truths and uniqueness. We must also remember, as Franz tells us, that projection happens when something is getting closer to consciousness. If we are honest with ourselves and psychologically minded, the content can be made conscious and worked with rather than influencing us from the shadowy realms. Projection can thus help us see the good, be it in a teacher, an analyst, another person, a culture, etc. Seeing the good out there can help that entity give the good back to us. It is an interactive process where both entities literally feel good and both are enriched by the connection. So a sense of gratitude is most important, for it feels like a gift to receive the good. As Ulanoff points out, this is especially important if good seems so far superior to oneself, as with a sense of divine love as the Christians think of God. Receiving such love feels like an act of grace. This is an experience everyone has upon receiving a big dream or a vision for one's life or for one's culture. I always tell my analysans in such circumstances to be grateful to whomever or however it is that you imagine you were sent your big dream. In Jungian terms, that would be the self, but you need a personal image or felt sense of the self, which is just a psychological term like the shadow or the persona. So as Ulanoff described it, to get to the root of envy, one must get to the emptiness at the core of the personality and the hunger for love and the good within the world and within oneself. So there's a lot of grief at this level and even shame for how they projected their hate onto the envied and persecuted them. So Cinderella was able to hold on to the good from her personal mother and connect with the archetypal good mother. When one is so heavily envied, you can't fight back. You can't offer good because that would be seen as being patronizing. Another way of dealing with being envied so harshly is to deny the good within yourself, because that is what is causing the envy problems. But that would make the envier feel even worse and attack them even more, because the envier feels like the good is being withheld from them. The attitude is, if I can't have the good, you can't have it either, and I'll destroy you for that. That is it. And I would like to say, Coco, maybe if you could just repeat it. I have a lot of people that have looked at the Chinese versions of these courses I've been giving outside of China, like in Singapore and in Indonesia. I think it would be good to give those that are seeing these videos, these recordings, the address of the Guangzhou Development Group. So maybe if you could just read that, IAAP_Guangzhou@foxmail.com, so people will know how to get in contact with the Sci-Heart group in China. Yes, in one week from a previous course that I had posted with the Chinese translation, there were 700 people, I think, from Singapore that looked at the video. So one thing that was going to be too difficult to do was to really work this fairy tale in a group. And it's really wonderful to see how everybody in the group relates to this archetypal material in different ways. It's a very rich experience. But like I said, because of the translations and the language difficulties, it's hard to get that group experience. But one thing that you might do would be to go through some of these fairy tales in a group, or look at what I presented here as some kind of an outline or a format as a basis for discussion in the group. And as I said, this is how most of us developed an archetypal and symbolic perspective on our lives, on cultural materials, on dreams, by practicing analyzing fairy tales so we could pass the big fairy tale final exam. And also, a lot of our courses had reference to fairy tales. And that's how you develop this perspective. One last thing I'd like to say before we go to discussion about this is Ulanoff's book is really good, and I could have done a whole lecture just on her take, but I really wanted to focus in this presentation on the Grimm's version, which puts such a heavy emphasis, I thought, on the masculine negative effect on the feminine. And that's not something that came through very strongly in the Ulanoff version. So I wanted to give you some sense of how different it feels between one version of Cinderella and another.
So the question is, it seems the Cinderella's story is a talk about, and they restrict the feminine energy that was restrained by the masculinity. So could you please give us an example to talk about and how this unrestrained feminine energy manifested in a woman?
I see it more broadly in the American women, where with the so-called liberated women and so on, in the earlier days of the women's movement in America, and I can't speak for Europe, but it was such a difficult issue for them to try to identify their feminine energies. And they really had to get together as women and talk about what it was like to be women. Then there was a phase where there was like the superwoman. She could have a profession, she could be a mother, she could be good in bed, and so on. So that was another way to try to fit the masculine image and so on. So those are things that, just working with women in general, that I probably a little more than a lot of Jungian analysts, I like to point out the layers of the collective unconscious and the influence on a woman, and particularly where I have seen it in working with women from a strong evangelical Christian background. They're the what I call 1950s type of male-female relationships are pretty clearly seen, where the belief is that in the traditional Christianity, the woman's place was in the home and to have babies and to cook. So particularly where I see it in working with women and that strong effect of the masculine, it's more likely to be seen in working with women that are trying to get out from under their evangelical religion. I did give the example before of a woman I worked with in Switzerland who really went into a terrible psychological state after her second husband just looked her in the face and said he didn't love her anymore and he was leaving her. And she just about went into a psychotic state. So we worked with her dreams for a long time. And I'd mentioned a dream she had that she was standing on the second floor of an apartment building, and her ex-husband was walking by, and he said, "Nobody loves you and nobody ever will." And we had worked it back after a long time, and several images of the father appearing in some positive roles sometimes. But she had this dream of seeing a father pushing a young girl on a swing. And she says to herself in the dream, "That's my problem. I was in love with my father like that little girl is." And it turns out that she was kind of the apple of her father's eye until she got to be about 4 years old and began to assert herself. And that's when the father began to reject her. So she, in her adult phase, had her own business and a fairly strong animus. And because of the father's rejection, was never fully able to connect with her own feminine energy. And there was something rather childlike about her in the way she presented herself, the way she talked about her friends, and so on. So it's that whole conglomerate of issues that one works with. But with her, it was very clearly a sense of the father putting herself down and including at the level of her feminine. So the main issue there is, and it's the main concern, like in psychoanalytic theory and psychological theory and so on, is that if you don't feel loved, if you don't feel there's something good in you, you're going to be hungry for that. And one thing that you might do is look for a male to save you, like a knight in white shining armor and so on. So particularly for a woman, you have to be in touch with the archetypal mother, if you will, but this is also true for a man. The archetypal mother as that which is nurturing, supporting, and loving. And if you don't have that foundation, as I try to develop with Cinderella, one of the things that can happen is being envious of other people that you think that you have it, and then you start persecuting them because they have something that you don't have, or you try to steal what they have, and so on. Maybe one more thing to say about that, because it relates to the alchemical marriage and the anima and the animus complementing each other, is that she liked to collect antique porcelain dolls, and she had one dream where she found a head of a doll, and she had the body of it. So it was about wanting to put those two things together. And then the father appeared in a subsequent dream where she was constructing, I think, a big dollhouse, and the father then appeared and was going to help put this heavy roof on top of the body of the dollhouse. So that was one way where this otherwise really negative father figure, anonymous, could have a helpful side in helping to bring together the upper and the lower, the spirit and the body, and so on and so on.
So in the primary family, the Cinderella seems the single girl, single child in a family. So the question is, we are wondering if it has to do with her, with this history, which means she may lack of the experience of interacting with the lack of the positive experience of interacting with the siblings, so that it's hard for her to integrate the good and evil.
Right. Well, this is probably in terms of her difficulty, probably easiest to imagine a real life situation where the mother dies, like in the Cinderella story, where the mother dies, is sick and dies, and then a stepmother comes in with her own daughters. And there's envy there from the beginning and maltreatment from the beginning. And that's where you can have a situation where you might not feel supported and all alone because perhaps the father is still mourning from the loss of his wife. And maybe the second wife that comes in is jealous of attention being given to his daughter in such need. So there are many ways, and just let yourself imagine the many ways that a young girl or a young person could feel isolated and not able to get help from the father. Like I said, the father himself may be depressed in such a situation, and certainly not getting help from the new stepmother, like one would hope would happen. So there are just many ways in which a young person, a young child, can end up feeling like all alone. And like I said, if envy is involved, then there can be a lot of this harsh type of persecution, like was described in Cinderella. And another thing that you see that's difficult in kind of another domain is if you have a single child in a family, you're the only child, then whatever difficult dynamics there may be in the family, you don't kind of have your siblings to connect with and get some help and support from.
Yeah. So Brave has a question about envy. One get awareness that we are jealous about others, and then we can reflect what we are envy about, and then how to work on deeper on our own to explore and our own issue to the envy or jealousy.
Right. And like I mentioned with the von Franz book, if she limited projection to something that was just about conscious. So if we can become aware of our projections, and that's one thing you can try to explore personally, or you certainly want to do it in analysis, is like, what do you envy in this other person? You know, what are you jealous about? What traits do they have? Or um, do you think they're more intelligent than you, more beautiful than you are, have talents that you had? So those are all things then you have to ask yourself, um, if you really have those possibilities within yourself and you haven't developed them. So this is related to one of the sins of sloth, that you may be envious of somebody who is really proficient at doing something, has developed some ability that you have, but you haven't. But it's because you haven't put in the effort to develop that for yourself. And there's some level where you feel bad about that, but that's where the sin of sloth, one of the seven deadly sins of sloth, comes in. But like I said, those are some of the shallower types of envy, which we can find in our shadow. But the really deep type of envy comes from like those early deep wounds, where at its core, what you have is just a feeling of being worthless and unloved and unlovable and having no good in yourself. So there are different degrees of this, and that's something important to keep in mind with this discussion. This can be very difficult to work with in analysis, because when you get to those deeper levels, you as an analyst can feel envy attacks on you. So it's hard to compliment the person or point out the good things, because they are not open to receiving anything good into themselves. There's so much being projected outward that they can't take the good in, and they can't relate to their own unconscious. So it can be, it's up to the analyst to try to survive the envy attacks, but it's not easy. And I like Winnicott in his many analogies to raising a child. He said the child, the parent has to be able to survive the attacks from the child. And it's very frightening for the child if they feel they can destroy the parent. So it's frightening for the analysand if they feel that they can destroy the analyst, even though at some level with this envy, that's what they want to do. The
那
analyst
温尼
is
科
be the container. I think in particular of a person I worked with, where there was a lot of projection onto me in relation to her very successful father. And when I would try to do a psychodynamic interpretation, it was met with some hostility, because that was felt like to be a reductionism for this person. So like I said, it gets very sticky.
巧莲 has a question about the image of a shoe, as you mentioned today, and remind her of 应该是一个来访者哈，remind one of her patients who had the bipolar disorder and who is really addicted to buying shoes. for such consumptionism. And she's wondering if the client is seeking for the self, maybe the small s self.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways one can look at that, looking at the Cinderella sisters, I mean, they were really into consumptionism, right? Beautiful clothes and all that. And you have to think of that as trying to look good, to maybe fill a vacuum, to feel the poverty within your own psyche. And it can be related, so that kind of consumerism, it's we see that so clearly here in America, where we get all these advertisements. America, I think 70% of our economy is from consumerism. And a lot of that started after World War II. So we're basically told again and again that we can buy happiness and we can buy meaning. You know, we just need a Visa card or something. That's the message that's pushed at a very early age. So basically, you're talking about the mother as matter and materialism, instead of the mother as kind of nurturing and loving and supporting you from the inside out. So the buying a lot of shoes can be one aspect of consumerism, and it is worthwhile thinking, is this some effort to find a good standpoint or to find the perfect expression of who one is? One might take that into consideration. Of course, if you're talking about bipolar, then you have to ask if all those shoes were bought during a manic phase, or just a very irrational, impulsive type of activity.
Then the next question is the rage. So could you please talk about rage from the archetypal perspective?
I like to think of rage as really something that comes from a deep sense that one's existence could be annihilated. So I kind of think of it like backing an animal into a corner, and that animal would feel like it's about to be killed or exterminated. So that they would fight back with everything they have. So that's how I think of rage. It's an indicator of how deeply wounded a person feels by some interactions. It's another level beyond anger. But like I said, the main concept there, I think, is of extinction, of one's life being eliminated. So it can be a good indicator of just how insecure and unshaky a sense of self that a person has. And in our fairy tale, an indicator of how poor the connection is with the mother, the mothering instinct, or the ability to mother ourselves, to feel good about ourselves, and so on. I love questions because
no,
you present the material, and then it's really interesting and important to see how people are relating to it and how they understand it. So this is interesting for me. I find it easier to relate to the Grimm's version because it just seems much more human. The Perot version, like I said, seems to me a little too saintly. But what I really liked about Ulanoff's presentation is she dove so deeply into the question of envy. And Osper didn't go that deeply into it. The Grimm's version of the fairy tale is one that I have often, particularly in working with women, referred to particular aspects of it. I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture that a woman that I've just started to work with had a very primal type of dream. And you often get this early in analysis. Those early dreams can be so important. And they really can kind of set the stage for the whole analytic process. So this woman, older now, has felt almost all her life that she wasn't living her true self. And with some of the dream work, early dream work we've done, she's just getting a sense of that. And there's a lot of grief about that. And I mentioned something about Cinderella, which she was familiar with, and she thought she was kind of further along. And I said, I think you're at the stage where Cinderella has planted the twig in her mother's grave and is crying. So you're at a very early stage. There's a lot of difficult emotional work ahead. So that's one way that I have used that tale to put the analysand, I was going to say the dreamer, into an archetypal framework, which can serve as a container. So to know that, my gosh, this is a universal fairy tale. People like forever have been caught in this. I'm not the first one. And if I follow the way Cinderella dealt with her really difficult issues, then I have some hope. I want to thank you for asking me to teach this course, and I'm excited that I've been invited to teach the Grimm's fairy tale Iron Hans. I see that as a real compliment to Grimm's Cinderella. The Grimm's Cinderella, as the way I presented it, was the masculine, too much yang, inhibiting development of the feminine. And in Iron Hans, it's really a fairy tale that I use with just about every man that I work with. And there, it's a feminine that inhibits the expression of the masculine energy. And that leads to, as presented in the fairy tale, a wild man, a very destructive masculine energy. And the fairy tale is about how a man then finds the gold in the dung, if you will. And it's quite an important issue here in America for two reasons, because we have a lot of so-called liberated women, and we have a lot of young men not knowing how to express their masculine energy in relation to the women. And we also have a lot of men that have been raised by single moms, poor moms, and things like that. Teenage mothers even, maybe even mothers with drug addiction and so on. So there's the way the masculine energy comes out can be in some very deadly forms, and attraction to some of these white supremacy groups and so on and so on. So the way that I frame it with the I Ching is that the Cinderella myth was the changing line 6, changing line 9, the old masculine, reverting to or changing into an 8, a Jungian, and in Iron Hans, it'll be an old yin, a changing line 6, changing into a 7, a Jungian. So that's my archetypal construct of these two fairy tales, dealing with some of the most basic level of the feminine and the most basic level of the masculine, kind of hexagrams 1 and hexagrams 2. So thank you, Shay Coco, for translating. And again, thank you for inviting me to teach the course, and I hope to see many of you for Iron Hans.
对，那谢谢大家谢谢大家的参与，那期待我们在铁汉斯的解读当中再次见到大家。Thank you, Dennis. It's very, very interesting.
Okay, 谢谢。